Brothers podcast, a 5 Pillars Imam Walid production.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers, sisters, friends and foes, and welcome to a very special episode of the Blood Brothers podcast with your host, Dilly Hussain. I'm currently in West Canada, touring 5 cities for United Islam Awareness Week. I want to give a big shout out to all the MSAs involved in this fantastic collaborative initiative. And I'm joined by one of my co-speakers who I'm touring West Canada with, and it's none other than Sheikh Dawud Walid. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Sheikh, how you doing?
Alhamdulillah, me as well.
You know, you're much more taller, more handsome than your Facebook pics. They were beautiful anyway.
Alhamdulillah.
May Allah bless you and preserve you.
Ameen.
Your age, your energy, everything.
Ameen.
How are you finding the tour so far? We've still got a heavy itinerary ahead of us.
Well, first night was good. Alhamdulillah, nice turnout. There was a couple of our brothers from the Qur'aniyun who were there, but we handled them during the Q&A. One of them tried to totally disrupt the program, but we look at these situations and we hope that the masses of the people got benefit, and we ask Allah Azza wa Jal to guide everyone, to guide us and to guide those Qur'aniyun brothers back to the proper path of the Qur'an and the authentic Sunnah of our beloved Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam.
It was interesting. Before we switched record, you were saying to me that you kind of miss the days where there were Sufi, Salafi discussions and debates, as divisive as they were, and the UK viewers know this very much so as well. But times have changed now. Why is it that a number of senior du'at and ulama miss those days as opposed to the challenges of today?
Well, back in the old days on the college campuses in the 90s, as you mentioned, it was those types of debates, but at least we were basing our debates on nusus, like there was some sort of textual evidence. It's the Quran, it's the books of ahadith. We talked about different rulings of the early fuqaha, but those are the old days, because now many of the bigger debates we have in the community, at least back in the States, is between those people who uphold the tradition, irrespective of madhab or manahij, and then those who've gotten off into really secular, liberal type of thinking, where their primary driver of their intellectual thought is based in a range of different philosophical traditions that aren't part of the Islamic tradition, from perennialism to critical theory, which produces critical gender studies and all of these types of things. So that's the state of affairs in America these days.
And I guess some of that has affected the UK as well. Do you fear that ulama themselves, the sacred holders of this deen, that they could too be affected by some of these ideologies and ways of thinking?
I think that overall, the ulama
in the West, namely,
the ulama in the West, I see overall in my travels in Canada in UK a few months ago, to here in Canada, to here I was even in Trinidad a few weeks ago. Alhamdulillah, the vast majority of scholars are preserving, upholding tradition. And this is what our Prophet said anyway, alayhi salam, ulama warathatul anbiya, that the ulama are the vanguards or the heirs of the prophets. I think where we lack sometimes is the difference between ulama and du'at who are rooted in the tradition, stay in the traditional circles, with the issue of popular speakers. And sometimes these popular speakers really aren't ulama, but because they're eloquent, maybe they have a large following on social media, and they're asked to speak at certain conferences that many times the awam confuse. Sometimes some popular speakers, male and female, they confuse them as being scholars when perhaps they aren't really scholars.
Okay, from what you've, and by the way, we don't, sometimes we name and shame this podcast, sometimes I choose not to. For the sake of this podcast, we're not going to name anyone. However, let's put that category of people aside. Right? Those who appear to come from an orthodox perspective. But I want to talk about those who tend to be from an activist background, from an academic background, a secular Western academic background, who at face value seem to be calling for noble and laudable things. Equality, justice, anti-racism, Islamophobia, equal rights, etc., etc. And it's interesting that you mentioned critical race theory, which is one amongst many theories or ways of thinking which is becoming increasingly prominent. How do we reconcile and bridge this growing split between traditional ulama and academics and activists who, many of whom I've engaged with, and they seem sincere in what they want to achieve.
Yeah.
But from their perspective, they will say that, look, the traditional ulama, those who are the practitioners of the sacred sciences, they're not with it. They don't understand how structural racism works and structural Islamophobia works, and they don't understand that women and LGBTQ and Muslims, all three communities are discriminated communities, and on all the kind of various arguments. What would your kind of response be? Is there an absence or a lack of knowledge amongst the traditional ulama with regards to understanding new challenges from a structural point of view?
Well, first of all, I think these two groups need to be in more conversation and discussion amongst each other in very purposeful gatherings, and it can't be simply a rad over Facebook or a rad over a YouTube, where one person does something or says something, then there's responses and it's back and forth. We saw this play out kind of ugly a few months ago, where an academic in America basically tried to shame Imam Zaid Shakir and Dr. Sherman Abdul Hakim Jackson. But besides the conversations, I do think there is some worth or some merit that ulama should listen to points of view and become more abreast with some of the social political challenges and trends. It just can't be that the people who are following these trends try to superimpose what they are viewing anecdotally or even empirically, to try to impose that upon the ulama, to force them to give the fatwa that they want to hear, or to hear the type of khutbah that they want to hear, right? So I think this is really part of the challenge. But definitely, and I've seen this too. I used to talk about this amongst friends in the 90s more so, but sometimes it would be a scholar that would come from abroad and wasn't born and raised in the American context and been here for a little bit of time, and their news or what they follow is not from the American society. It's watching Al Jazeera or watching GOTV or whatever, right? And then their lectures sometimes are void from socio-political context. I mean, and just to give an example of how important this is, that scholars need to be very aware of this, that traditionally in the Maliki school of thought, there were different sub-branches, we could say, that broke off and developed in the Maliki school. Like, for example, because so you'd have the Medini jurists, and then you had the Egyptian jurists and the Iraqis or the Maghribis and the Andalusis. Well, on certain issues that relate to mu'amalat and transactions, that the Maghribi scholar may give a different opinion on something than the Iraqi, or the Medini scholar might give something different from the one Al-Andalus. Why? Because there's some different socio-political context as far as like more interaction with Ahlul Kitab, and some other like local factors on the ground, and this is why Adat and Urf are very important in the Maliki school of thought, to understand the local customary practice as well as the culture of the people. So it is, I would say, it is incumbent that that scholars do become aware of the socio-political trends and the cultures of the lands that they live in, but at the same time, there can't be an issue where someone comes up with some sort of theory, or they try to use some sort of theory to actually abrogate what are called al-qatiyat, or the incontrovertible injunctions. Like, that can't override ijma of what Muslims have held to be moral and immoral for the last 14 centuries. So this is the problem of sometimes of these academics and activists, and this is why the ulama are the vanguards and the protectors of the tradition and those things that aren't subject to debate no matter what land Muslims live in.
Now, you've written a book called Sacred Activism.
Yes,
right?
towards
Sacred Activism.
Yes, towards sacred activism.
And it's a very interesting topic because within that book you cite, a prophetic perspective on justice and other areas which should shape and model shape our activism. However, what do you then do when you're living at a time where you have ulama, both in the West and the Muslim majority world, who unfortunately, for whatever reason, seem to clearly be on the wrong side of justice, and in many cases, they're not find themselves on the side of tyranny and oppression.
Yeah.
What to do then? Again, not to mention names.
Yes.
Whether it be in the West, we have certain ulama who justify and contextualize state CVE laws discriminate against Muslims and people of color. Whether that be ulama going from the West to the Muslim world to stamp an approval of oppressive regimes.
That's correct.
And wars and occupation. Where does sacred activism stand in these matters?
Okay, that's a very good question. So there are matters that are clear-cut and crystal clear. And then there are certain matters that we could consider to be speculative or issues what we would call ijtihadi, right? So sometimes a scholar may be involved in something or meeting with certain government officials, and we look at it on the surface and say this person is collaborating with this oppressive government, or they're being used as a tool, where in fact that scholar may be meeting with people to mitigate harm, right? Because this is a real thing. Like sometimes our voices do need to be heard. And al-amru bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, enjoining the good and forbidding evil, is incumbent upon us as Muslims. And if a person who has personal access is speaking to governmental leaders, they will have a different adab, a different form of doing that than just common people on the street who are raising their voices. At the same time, it's very problematic when you do have scholars who are the ulama al-salatin, right? They are the scholars of the governmental authorities and actually celebrate leaders or celebrate oppressive regimes, right? This in itself is very problematic. So as we can have husnul dhan for the one who may go and meet with the leaders, but they're not celebrating governmental leaders, not celebrating regimes, we do have that other issue. And I would say that our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he warned us about being at the gates of the governmental authorities, because we know that fitan comes along with that, right? It's the duty, I believe, of people who are close to these scholars, who have access, of course, with proper adab and with all due respect, have to remind these scholars about their role in not celebrating or actually co-signing zulm upon the Muslims. So we can't have fanboys and fangirls for shuyukh, right? And this is actually one of the eras that we know about Beni Israel, by the way, right? That they, or the people of the book that take their monks and their rabbis as arbab, as lords, right? And in the tafsir of this, it is said that they didn't pray to them, nor they fast for their sake, but that they blindly followed them. And they followed them when they made the impermissible permissible, right? And this is how they made them their lords. So those things that are part of the ad-daruriyat, necessities of the deen, all of the common Muslims, everyone is supposed to know those. And when we see someone openly celebrating tyranny, we see someone openly celebrating the murder of Muslims, or celebrating regimes that are openly murdering the Muslims, these ulama, and we respect their ijazat, we respect their degrees, but they're not people that we should be fanboying and fangirling and being a part of their club and going out and defending them, or thinking that, they're, I heard this one particular sheikh, someone said, this is a wali of Allah, and whoever is at enmity with a wali of Allah is like, Allah is at war with them. I'm like, well, like you can't invoke wilaya.
Yeah.
Like a wali of Allah is not going to like openly celebrate Muslims being bombed in the country or scholars being put on death row. May Allah Azza wa Jal free our scholars who are unjustly locked up in parts of the Muslim world. This is my view.
But sacred activism, or towards sacred activism, surely should have some parameters and red lines.
Definitely.
Right? And what I tend to find, and this applies to the UK as well, right? We'll get to social media in a bit.
Yeah.
But in terms of the awam,
yeah,
which includes everything from students to taxi drivers to academics to activists to mothers to daughters to college students. It's an array of different people from different backgrounds. Is there any legitimate grounds for the awam to hold ulama to account? Is there any normative basis for the masses to hold the ulama to account? Because one thing I've heard, Sheikh, is only ulama can hold other ulama to account. This is something which I've heard a lot as well. Is there any space with adab? That's a caveat, of course, without a shadow of a doubt. But is there any space or any room when a Muslim is in a journey towards sacred activism that a time may come where they have to address scholars and hold them to account as they would do with their leaders?
Well, most definitely. I mean, no one is beyond reproach, and there are people who should talk to and bring forth concerns to ulama. And the scholars of our tradition, we don't believe that they're ma'sumin. We don't believe they're infallible. Like, we don't see someone as some like grand supreme leader or ayatollah that we just have to accept that everything that they've said or every position that they've made is somehow binding upon us. That's not our way. Some people have critiqued this narration, but will invoke it for the sake because there's wisdom in it. So we know that from the narrations that Umar ibn al-Khattab, Ridwanullahi ta'ala, in the issue of one of the women from the Awam, we don't even know that she was even from the Sahabiyat.
Regarding Mahar.
Yeah, regarding Mahar, yeah. But she was common woman, raised the issue about the Mahar where he tried to put a cap on it, and she stood up and told, this is the first man to carry title Amir al-Mu'mineen. I mean, even Abu Bakr as-Siddiq was Khalifatul Rasul. He wasn't called Amir al-Mu'mineen, but she stood up and said to Amir, and as we know, Omar wasn't a pushover. He wasn't like some softy, and she stood up and corrected the leader of the Muslims, and he said that that Omar is wrong and this woman is right. So this is, and we wouldn't be foolish to say that any scholar in the UK or America has a level of ilm of Umar al-Khattab, right? No. But I mean, whoever said that, they're completely delirious, right? So so if this took place to some of the greatest Muslims, where people of the Awam didn't fear that they would be castigated or blacklisted from the community, would bring up a concern, or even bring up where they think that a scholar makes an error. If it didn't happen way back then we shouldn't be trying to play that card. This is an alim and he's a wali, and how dare you question a wali of Allah, question this alim, like, who do you think you are? I don't think that's, and any real scholar doesn't mind not only being questioned, but even to be at times challenged about their views, right? And that's my response to those people. I say you have no business questioning a scholar or questioning their opinion. And then also, when scholars are in tough jams, sometimes they will even reach out to other people just to get their opinion. And I've seen this happen before as well. So
now, ideally, we want to have you and our listeners to actually buy the Sheikh's book. There will be a link for it at the bottom of this podcast. However, if there's some red lines and some parameters that you could briefly give the lay Muslims, that when they embark on speaking truth to power or holding leadership and leaders and rulers and ulama to account, can you give us some red lines as to these things should not be crossed when you're embarking on this?
Okay. So knowledge is very important, and also remembering adab is both very important. So in all of our books, when we read about the conditions of enjoying the good and forbidding the evil, because really this is what we're talking about, speaking truth to power. Al-amr bil ma'ruf nahy anil munkar, that there are shurut to al-amr bil ma'ruf nahy anil munkar, meaning conditions like any other command, and of it is that one must know what is ma'ruf and what is al-munkar, which means there needs to be some sort of knowledge, right? And in order for something to be just, in order to be wholesome, then it's based in sidq, in truthfulness, right? And so we have to understand the truth and try to investigate and be robust as much as we can, which means there has to be ilm involved, right? It just can't be feelings. Just can't say, oh, I feel that he did something wrong or she did something wrong. So there has to be some grounding or some basis. I would also say that when we're talking to our ulama, and if we're able to contact them, the first step should not be this so-called call out or cancel culture, right? Rasulullah alayhi salam didn't cancel people, right?
By cancel, you mean writing them off, making videos, writing posts before even directly contacting them?
Exactly. Trying to contact them. So
what if they're beyond reach? Because what I've
some are beyond reach. Yeah.
Because a common thing I've heard is that, look, yeah, that's great. If we could get hold of this sheikh, he's up in his ivory tower. How am I going to get hold of him? I have to go through his entire entourage before I have to get through to him.
Well, and it's interesting you mentioned this, because I was discussing this with a situation that I know, that if the sheikh is that inaccessible to even have any sort of communication, then that's just something that's a symptom of a bigger issue, perhaps, right? But in terms of those who we can...
Why do you think that scholars generally should be accessible to the masses, irrelevant of how big and grand they are?
Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was accessible to anyone who came. He was not able to... He didn't have a special chair. He was when a visitor came and didn't know what he looked like, and he was amongst his Sahaba, no one could look at his dress or look at who he was physically to see, who he was, right? When one of the luminaries in Islam, for instance, in our history, Sayyida Nafisa, who was a big scholar, actually a spiritual teacher of Imam Shafi'i, she would be amongst the people. And again, we're talking about, well, obviously no one can be at the maqam of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but even someone who's great like Sayyida Nafisa, these people were accessible. I mean, this is a female scholar too, right?
Without digressing,
right. I'm sorry for digressing.
No, but it's important. It's important. So very briefly, why have we got to a stage where certain ulama are inaccessible, both in the West and in the Muslim world? Why have we got to this stage?
Perhaps there are different reasons for different shuyukh. For the scholars for dollars who do the bidding for corrupt governments, they don't want to be seen accessible to the generality, one, because they're working for the state, and then two, they themselves, who have been facilitators or helping of injustice, may fear actual reprisal. But let's put those people aside. Like I mentioned, for instance, the Mufti of Syria. Like I just drop a name, Ahmed Hassoun, right? He's a Mufti for the regime. it's understandable why he's
it wouldn't be accessible to the
yeah,
masses.
he wouldn't be accessible to the masses, right? But then you have some other shuyukh, I believe, who have, well, I say three groups of people. You have shuyukh who have these entourages and aren't accessible because they see it as part of an allure to make themselves appear to be above the masses. It gives them a type of grandeur, a type of so-called posture, right? Then I think there's a third group, and this is true too, 'cause I know this in some cases. There are some scholars or teachers who have gatekeepers. And meaning is that, there's ways of maybe emailing them and talking with them, but they have schedulers because they're so busy.
Okay.
They have planners or people who are helping with their schedule because they're actually so busy. And then the planner or the handler will then not relay all communication or only relay certain communication to other people because that planner is operating from a nafsani position. It's about their ego because they have the power or the control to see who gets access to the sheikh and who doesn't, and they use it for their own
for their own reputation,
for their egoism, their own egotistical reasons, and even with some of them, maybe it's even some sort of financial benefit that could be gained. I think there's three different reasons, but outside of these very extremely popular speakers, the adab of speaking with your local scholar or even a scholar you have access to is made a problematic position. The first rule of al-amr bil ma'ruf nahy anil munkar is to enjoin the good and forbid the evil with a sense of a mild tone and the level of kindness.
Not harshness.
Not harshness, much less calling them names or yelling at them. So we'll just use the Quran as an example of hujjah for this position. We know that the worst tyrant mentioned in the Quran is Fir'aun. And Musa and Harun alayhi salam were two prophets that were commanded to go to Fir'aun to do this al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. And when they were commanded to go, Allah Azza wa Jal gave them the command, فَقُولَ لَهُ قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا لَعَلَّهُ يَتَذَكَّرُ وَيَخْشَى.
Layyina.
Yes, that when you go to Fir'aun, the worst of the worst, that you go speak to him in a mild tone, lest he remember or fear.
What are the verses that follow that verse? The verses that follow that very verses, then it indicates a level of harshness from Musa alayhi salam to Fir'aun.
Yes.
And Musa alayhi salam did eventually become very harsh.
Yes, but his starting approach, the first approach when he went to Fir'aun, the first approach is before you double down and then before you come with the harsher tone, the first step is to go with a level, and again, we're not, and the point that I'm really trying to get at is that
the first point of call at the very least.
The first point, but also Sheikh Fulan bin Fulan, I don't think he's Fir'aun. Even if he's made a problematic position, right?
He's definitely not Fir'aun.
He's not Fir'aun, right? Yeah. So that's why I say, but there is a level of sometimes there needs to be an escalation of language and tone in regards to speaking to people. We also have the saying of at-takabbur ala mutakabbir sadaqa, right? So it doesn't mean that having takabbur in one's heart thinking you're better, but basically to put someone who is arrogant in their place is a form of sadaqah. This isn't a hadith, by the way, but this is a saying that comes from the Salihin, right? So there is a time for that. Now, if the person is unable to be spoken to directly, I would say, in my opinion, the next step would be to reach out to someone that you know who has access, right? So even amongst some of these shuyukh, they have a contemporary, they have a colleague, or they have someone who can talk to the person and relay a concern. So I'll just give you an example real quick. Like, I'm going to name drop right here. A few years ago, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf made some comments at Reviving the Islamic Spirit.
About Black Lives Matter?
About Black Lives Matter. Now, I thought that, and I'm not a supporter of Black Lives Matter, by the way, but I thought that, and many people thought that Sheikh Hamza's comments in the context were very
Regards to police brutality and black families looking at their own family makeup and issues.
Basically that his response to the systematic targeting of African Americans by law enforcement, from mass incarceration to beatings to murders, is that, oh, well, you know, if you got your families together in order, then you wouldn't be getting beat up or killed by the police, which is preposterous, right? It's a preposterous position. So, but the point of it is that many people were upset. I said something to one of these people who was close to Sheikh Hamza. I didn't have his contact information. It was relayed, and then Sheikh Hamza got my phone number, and he gave me a call. And I talked to him about it, and I encouraged him, for instance, to apologize, right? Now, he apologized the next day, and maybe the way he apologized actually made people more angry. But the point is, is that I reached out to someone who then had access to the concern, and he was humble enough to call and want to listen to the concern. So I just bring that up as an example that sometimes, and he's one of these people in the States who's seen as kind of like a rock star sheikh, right? Or like a rock star scholar. But now maybe
not so much of late.
Yeah, not as well. Yeah, but now maybe some people might retort back, well, they say, well, Dawood, you're a sheikh, so maybe that's why he called you. But if you weren't, then maybe he wouldn't have called you. And maybe that is true. But the point is that before I wrote something on a Fusuq book to try to put them on blast. That's why I call Facebook Fusuq book. I went to someone and said, this is highly problematic. I didn't like it at all. And then within about 4 hours, I got a call.
Staying on just Sheikh Hamza Yusuf is perhaps the best example in terms of trying to contextualize some of these realities that we're talking about. So we had his comments about Black Lives Matter. And police brutality. We had his comments about Ikhwan al-Muslimin and other kind of...
Which I thought his Ikhwan comment was actually even more dangerous than the Black Lives Matter comment, for sure.
Yeah, and then you obviously have his frequent visits to the UAE, the peace conference. He made some comments about the Syrian uprisings very recently. Next day he apologized. How do we then... The Muslims, sincere Muslims who have a ghira and a genuine sentiment for the affairs of the Muslims, deal with a rock star Sheikh like Hamza Yusuf, who seems to have, sadly, unfortunately, for whatever reasons, and I'm sure he has his reasons, the kind of comments seem to just come up every 6 to 8 months. Black Lives Matter, political Islam, Syrian revolution. There's one thing or another that's coming up, and it's usually followed by an apology, or that someone's jet lagged. Or what do you do?
Well, I would say one, we have to continue to make dua for our brothers and sisters who fall into this and who make mistakes.
Right? Do you think the challenges are distinctly more difficult and harder than perhaps the lay people?
I think their challenges in many ways are more, when you're very popular with access, you have more problems of falling into pitfalls and making mistakes, especially if you're more public and the target or the spotlight is on a person. So for instance, if someone, before I finish with the answer, I'll give an example. So there was a few years back when Obama was still president, that there was a movement talking about, well, boycott the White House iftar. And it said, I wouldn't go to the White House iftar. But the funny thing about it is that 99% of people who said this, they would never be invited to begin with. They have no access. So it's a very theoretical situation, right? But if you were invited and put that test, would you go to Obama's iftar? And then if you did go, would you say something to him? I wouldn't have gone. Myself personally. I wasn't a friend of I don't need to go and eat hummus with Obama if I can't have a conversation, especially when he invites the Israeli ambassador to the White House while Gaza is being bombed during Ramadan. So no, I'm not of that school of thought, right? But besides praying for brothers and sisters who get involved in these issues and make mistakes, the corrections that should be done and should be lifted up or shared, I believe, should still be respectful. In other words, it's about the issues and not about the personality. So I know some people who are African American, who are activists and academics. They went as far as to like say that Sheikh Hamza Yusuf is a white supremacist. Like that's outrageous. It's outrageous.
That's a common one that's been circulated.
Yeah.
And not just with Hamza Yusuf, but with like there's other like Ismail Roya and others who have been labelled like white supremacists or people who simply just are oblivious to black lived experiences of that people of colour. It's a common thing that I'm seeing, especially not just for Book, but for Twitter and everything as well. It's very common.
So that shouldn't be the discourse. I mean, number one, we should be fearful of Allah not being involved in qadhf or slander, because to say that your Muslim brother or sister is a white supremacist is a very strong position. It's a very strong name to call someone, especially in the American context. So that's one thing that I would like to lift up in regards to this. But the other thing is that,
what about white savior complex? What about this attitude, this mindset, which I would humbly present that we even have in the UK, where white Caucasian converts who tend to come from an upper middle class background. We're not talking about white converts that come from a working class background. Those that come from an upper middle class background, usually a very devout Christian background, come to the deen and they kind of look at African and Asian and non-white culture as regressive and backward, and they approach their da'wah as constantly telling Asians and blacks and Arabs and Turks and Kurds and Africans where they're going wrong. Is there a difference between white supremacy, which is very harsh term, and a white savior complex?
It could just be someone as being, as you mentioned, like being oblivious, and it is the role of those Asians or those Africans who are around these people to actually talk to them and to educate them, not to come to their defense all the time and act as if they're ma'soom, which in cases, I believe, when there's been some people that have made these mistakes or said some of these things and come off in such a way, I actually blame the brown brother and sister or the black brother and sister who are close to them, who have access to actually defend what they say. Right, to actually defend their positions, because
that perpetuates
that perpetuates it. So if someone is uninformed or ill-informed because they never have that lived experience, who haven't gone through that, and they've grown up with this middle class, upper middle class, white background in these societies, then how are they supposed to know, right? So there's a level of education. So obviously, when people convert to Islam or become Muslims, they just don't declare the Shahadatain and everything that's in their heart or in their mind is eliminated. I mean, this didn't even happen with the Sahaba, right? Who was the best generation. So they had to go through a level of evolution and being educated. Absolutely. Likewise, some of these individuals who make these types of comments, there has to be a level of constant education. And also, too, if someone has held a particular view for 30 years, 40 years, you can't expect just talking to them one time, or as we say back in the old days, of pulling someone's coat one time. You can't expect them that their whole mentality, their whole worldview is going to change with just one conversation. There has to be repetition.
Bringing the podcast to a close, I want to raise something with you.
Sure.
When I first came into contact or exposure, and by the way, I've benefited from your Facebook post, so it's not full book for you. Although I've benefited a lot from your posts and your commentaries. May Allah accept it from you, I mean. But one thing I did notice in some of your posts, you highlight the skin color of certain prophets and certain companions.
Sure.
To recall two specific examples, I recall there have been others. There's one which you mentioned about Musa alayhi salam, which, by the way, I believe the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam even described about his skin complexion, that it was dark.
Yes.
But you also, if I recall, please correct me, that Imam Hussain, was he? There was someone from Ahlul Bayt that you mentioned.
Yes, definitely.
What's the need to highlight the skin complexion of prophets and companions?
Okay, so let's go back to this process. Is actually, it relates to a problem that we saw, myself and the co-author of our Centering Black Narrative books, that we saw a level of not only anti-Black comments and behaviors in certain segments of the Muslim community, but also like a whitewashing of history, right? So the first and primary reason is that history should be told correctly for the sake of history. But we also found it to be very interesting that in these, we're not just coming up with these descriptions out of our heads. They're mentioned in al-Bukhari, they're mentioned by Ibn al-Jawzi, they're mentioned by like great and prolific scholars, that when we would mention some of these things, there would be some brothers that would have very harsh responses, almost like, well, why you have to mention that? But if it's mentioned about Sayyidah Aisha having lighter colored skin and red hair, that's not problematic. So the issue is, why is it problematic to mention a prophet or someone from the Sahaba or someone from the descendants of the Prophet from Ahlul Bayt having dark skin? But if someone has lighter skin, or many times, like when people read the Shama'il, or they talk about how the Prophet looks, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and talk about his skin color.
Sheikh, wouldn't it be then the reason why the lighter skin tone? I'm just playing advocate here. Wouldn't it be the case that if the reason why the lighter skin tone of a companion or a prophet was mentioned was because the default baseline was darker skin?
Definitely, it was darker skin. And some of them are mentioned also as being very dark. But some of these great people, their appearances were mentioned or written down in books. But we wrote this for two reasons. The first reason is just to relay history in a more accurate way. Like, for instance, and I had to go through this with my children, like when they saw The Message, for instance, very good movie, and they have Sumayya being seen looking like a Greek woman. I thought, well, Sumayya was a black woman. Like, she had black skin. Ammar bin Yasser had very dark skin. Like, if you were to look at that movie, the only black Sahabi you would think was Sayyidina Bilal, right? So I had to say, look, this is not accurate. And this is also something, when people are brown or black, it's important that they're able to see, or at least to read about images that reflect how they look, that everyone else just doesn't look like someone else, right? But the other thing, besides of clarifying this, is that there is a reality, at least within the American context. I can't speak to it as much as UK or Canada, but there is an issue of colorism in our community. There is an issue of anti-blackness in our community. So we wrote this to try to give clarity. For instance, I remember some South Asian Muslims coming to me and being so happy when I gave a lecture, and I mentioned that Sayyidina Ali, Karramallahu Wajha, that after Fatima Zahra passed away, he married a woman who gave birth to his son Muhammad, known as Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya. And I described her as Kanat Sindiya Sauda, that she was a woman with black skin from the region of Sindh, which is modern day Pakistan, right? So I mentioned that, and people were like, oh, I didn't know, and thank you. And especially when you have some girls in our community who to this day are passed over for marriage, or the auntie wants her to go through a boot camp of Fair and Lovely for 1 month before the nikah or the walima, so she comes out so she can look fair.
Yeah,
it's a problem.
Colorism and anti-dark skin most definitely exists within the Indo-Pak Bengali community. That goes without a shadow of a doubt. Yeah. But I guess the point I'm trying to stress is that, yes, without a shadow of a doubt, there were companions that were most definitely of a dark skin complexion, right? You're then, if I'm correct in understanding, you're saying that because that's been whitewashed in the books of history, there's an importance to re-highlight that.
Exactly. And this is why we went to the original sources. We even went through the commentaries of Imam Nawawi, rahmatullahi alayhi, and talking about some of the hadith, like what did the Prophet mean, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he said a person was ahmar and when a person was aswad, right? Like, what does that actually mean, right? So, yeah, we highlighted that in the books. Actually, I don't even talk about it as much as I used to, because when we first wrote this and we're talking about this was on after the issue of the murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson, and actually a lot kind of was exposed in the community on Fusuq book, where a lot of anti-black comments were being made by American Muslims, like, if the people there didn't act like savages, then the police wouldn't police them like that. And actually, I know some Muslims personally from Lebanese background that I really stopped talking with, because their conversations had gotten so
Toxic.
yeah, I don't like using that term because that so-called toxic masculinity. So I try to stay with that term, but it got so bad, right? Yeah. But the level of anti-blackness and some of the things that arose in the Muslim community, and even people seeing the issue, even some Muslim brothers who were killed by the police, that not being seen as a Muslim enough issue. This is part of what spurred this type of discourse. Now, my discourse and what I write about has primarily changed, because internal racism in the Muslim community and colorism, I don't see that as even one of the top 3 issues anymore. What I've been focusing on more is, one, the issue of trying to get us back to the tradition, and to give us and to try to safeguard us from this liberal so-called woke thought, like leading us not into only deviant beliefs, but also kufr. This is the primary concern. I also have a very high concern of raising young Muslim boys into being responsible Muslim men, because there's been a level of emasculation.
You discussed in the Mad Moments podcast.
Well, we have a bunch of weak backs and a bunch of soft brothers who aren't being manly, right? And these are probably like my 2 top concerns. And then another concern, because I have a daughter, but this relates back to the first point about the liberal thought and the woke culture, but it's this radical feminism that has affected the thoughts in our community, which is leading to a number of negative social consequences, from sisters delaying marriage, not being able to find suitable mates, not saying they want to be married at all, and some other antisocial things. I'll just give you an example of something that startled me that I heard about that happened on the West Coast. But a sister, a professional, has her own career, has her own money, never got married but wanted to have children. So she went for artificial insemination and got some like random nutfa injected into her to have a kid. But then she went to a sheikh who I know and wanted to have the aqiqah in the Islamic center, in the masjid, for a baby that she had from some random sperm. So that can't be allowed in the masajid, not because the child, that there's no blame on the child, but we can't normalize this, right?
You normalize that, you open like a floodgate of madness.
Yeah, it's a floodgate of madness, right? So like then sisters will just be going to go get some random sperm from God knows who to have children with no father figure there, no one there, and like it's madness, right? So like these are like some of the major things. My top 3 issues of addressing on a macro level. Obviously, there's other issues in the community. There's a rising, in our locality, there's a rising issue of Muslims getting hooked on drugs and also selling drugs, right? Like it's.
But that's been there for time, though, Chef. We have like gangbangers and shotters and drug dealers and trapsters. That's been there for time.
It's been going on, but like in our area, not to this extent of young guys overdosing and dying. So like, for instance, in Dearborn, Michigan, I know of just over the summer of 15 cases of Muslims overdosing and dying off of opioids alone, not including the overdoses off of cocaine, right? And then Muslims who are getting caught up in the drug trade. They're getting involved in getting HIV from the practices that go along with drug use and needles.
You're saying it's getting worse in the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years, from the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. You think it's
the opioid crisis amongst Muslims has gotten worse because it's gotten worse in the broader society.
Okay.
Right. So, and this is a real problem. But even that, as much as I worry about that, that's still not one of the top three things of concern, at least on my radar.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Bringing the podcast to a close, one final comment I need from you, right?
Yes.
What advice would you give to non-Black Muslim scholars who want to address issues pertaining to a respective community, the Black community? Let me tell you why I will ask you this.
Yes.
In the UK, there's a perceived problem of Asian/Pakistani grooming gangs. That Pakistani/South Asian men target young white girls because they're seen as easy flesh, easy targets, mostly underage. They're seen as easy game, and then they kind of.
But that's not a big problem, is it?
It's made significantly bigger by the press and the politicians.
That's what I would think.
But it does exist.
It exists.
Yeah, like sexual exploitation of youngsters that transcends all communities, right?
Yeah.
But there seems to be a disproportionate focus on it happening in the North and the Midlands of the UK. So we have certain ulama that come out and they give Friday khutbahs addressing the issue of young Muslim men or young Asian Pakistani men not targeting young white girls, etc., etc. And sometimes some issues, even though they transcend communities and it applies everywhere, sometimes they're applied usually in absence of data.
Right.
What advice would you give to Muslim scholars, imams, to address issues pertaining to the Black community? In the UK, the census report 2011, this is official government data, said that the highest number of single parent families were from African Caribbean communities. The highest number of the way they define married coupled families, right? The lowest number was from African Caribbean communities. Now, of course, based on that, there was a number of integration reports that came out, most of which were carried out by racists themselves. But nevertheless, the point was made based on data that African Caribbean communities in the UK have the highest number of single parent families, and that this has a socio-economic effect in the way they have their relationship with the establishment, authority, etc., etc. Now, how can one address this issue without uttering racist stereotypes? Because we know the historical relationship with Black communities, especially in the States, it has to be understood from the place of the transatlantic slavery, from European colonialism. It has to be understood from a structural and institutional point of view, right? But how do you address these issues without being labeled, oh, look, my guy's just come and he's just writing off the Black community?
Well, two things I would say. I think the first thing is that those scholars need to be involved in discussions with their peers who are from African descent, right? And if they have questions about this or how they address it, they should get information and understand the sensitivities and maybe the history. And they can learn this from having the discussions with those Black imams, scholars, or community leaders. I think this is fundamental, right? I think the second thing is we have to question if that imam or these scholars aren't addressing Afro-Caribbean communities. Is it an issue? Sorry about that. Is it an issue that they should be speaking on the Manaber to majority Asian Jama'ah or a totally Asian Jama'ah? Like what is the maqsad by that discourse in that Jama'ah if it doesn't apply to that Jama'ah? Like why even have that discussion to begin with? So there's wisdom that needs to be involved in regards to these discussions. I will tell you that in the American context, so let me finish this point. In the American context, there's a similar issue where the highest percentage of people who have wedlocks out of birth are African American people, right? However, this doesn't apply to the Muslim community, right? So even if you're having this discussion in a khutbah where everyone in the Jama'ah is a descendant of enslaved Africans, or they're immigrants from Gambia, from Senegal, or etc., giving this khutbah and focusing on that issue where it doesn't affect the Musallin that are there, then you have to wonder why this is being addressed in a khutbah, and if it is addressed, what is the lesson that is being derived for these Muslims to engage with their non-Muslim family members, right? So it requires a level of wisdom,
and an assessment of benefit.
Yeah, it's a wisdom and assessment of benefit. So there's certain issues that I would talk about amongst imams and or people who study a particular text, like for instance, Al-Mudawwana al-Kubra, who was written by one of the chief students of Imam Malik. Would I go in front of the awam and discuss some very particular issues when they're not Malikis and don't understand the issue? No, I wouldn't. Why? Because it wouldn't have any benefit, and in fact, it may cause confusion even to discuss certain things in the text, right? Likewise, we have to assess the benefit, or why would something need to be discussed in the begin with, and then there's a level of education, and then sometimes we have to look at not just the message, but the messenger who's giving the message. Is the person the appropriate person to deliver this message in this particular audience? I think is very important. For instance, I wouldn't go in front of a Jama'ah and lecture South Asians about how they should deal with the issue of Kashmir. That wouldn't be appropriate for me to do, right? Even though I care a lot about Kashmir and the dhulm that's going on there.
I think you should.
Maybe I'm not the most appropriate. It's my job to raise the awareness of Kashmir and what's going on in the history that I've learned from Kashmiri brothers, to go in front of Arabs, to go in front of the African community and raise that concern, or invite them into the community and have someone who's Kashmiri or someone who's Pakistani
to talk to
the black people about the suffering, the history of the Kashmir, because they understand it better than I do.
But I just found that I totally agree with you, and you actually responded and answered all my proposed interjections here.
Okay, sorry.
No. You respond to it. I just feel that we may enter a scenario where only black ulama and imams can talk about black issues, and only the Arab can speak about Arab issues, and only the South Asians can talk about South Asian issues. And we are Ummatul Wahid. We are one body, and we should be able to talk about each other's affairs. But you're saying that the caveat should be knowledge, understanding, and perhaps linking up the different communities together. So you talk about Kashmir to the black community, or maybe bring a South Asian Kashmiri speaker to speak to the black community about Kashmir. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I would say I would say that. But even there's sometimes maybe where there are some suggestions or certain things that are being said in front of an all South Asian community from someone who's black or someone's Arab. So I'm not saying that these topics are completely hands off to discuss it all, but there has to be a level of wisdom and a level of caution, because we have to understand our knowledge level, and we also have to understand the sensitivities of the people. And this is in public speaking classes, they say that the first rule of public speaking, know your audience. Well, this is a saying of Sayyidina Ali when he said, "Khatba an-nas ala qadri qulihim," that you have to speak to people or preach to people according to their mentalities. Absolutely. Right? So this is, you have to understand how you have to try to discern how is what I'm going to say affect the general. I mean, there's always going to be a few people here and there, but the generality, right, when you're speaking to audiences.
It was an absolute pleasure.
Alhamdulillah.
May Allah bless you in the next.
Ameen.
Brothers and sisters, and that is all for today's episode. For our viewers and listeners from North America, subscribe to the Mad Mamluks channel. For those of you watching from the UK and Europe and elsewhere, subscribe to the 5 Pillars YouTube channel. Another shout out to the 5 universities in West Canada. in Calgary, in Saskatchewan, in Burnaby, in Vancouver, in Edmonton. A big shout out to all the MSAs involved in United Islamic Awareness Week. May Allah bless you and accept all your efforts. Ameen. Leave a comment, like this video, and until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Blood Brothers Podcast. 5 Pillars of Mad Monolith Production.